Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 18th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as I mentioned over the past couple of episodes, I am at home recovering right now from surgery, and so I'm recording this episode intro in advance. I also recorded this week's interview in advance so that I can give myself a little bit of time to heal without working. So I don't know what's happened in the world in the last couple of weeks because I'm time traveling while I record this, and hopefully it's nothing that prevents this episode from making any sense. But I think we should just dive right in. I do want to thank my patrons, as always. I don't want to read you off the list because I don't know if anybody's new, but thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if you want to support the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. Okay, so this week I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Jancy McPhee. Dr. McPhee is a neurobiologist who studied biophysics at Brandeis for her PhD. She worked in cellular and molecular neuroscience in academia for 17 years before she joined the National Space Biomedical Research Association and later the University Space Research Association to manage various aspects of NASA's domestic and international space life sciences research programs. And later, she founded SciArt Exchange, which is a nonprofit that aims to inspire the world about space, science, and technology, and also promote public understanding about and contribution to science and technology issues. So we're going to hear all about her fascinating career, about the intersection of STEM and STEAM, or STEM and art to make STEAM, and so much more. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Jancy McPhee. Well, Jancy, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's really great to be here. Thank you.
It's fascinating that we have, I guess our paths have crossed twice now. We've been introduced online twice, once actually by two different people who have been on the show. Once by Mark Jackson, who was like a very, very early interview of mine, probably in my first year of doing Talk Nerdy back in 2014. And then once by Nicole Stott, whose episode just only aired a few weeks ago. So it's so funny when it's like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, isn't it?
Well, I really like it because, it's just a hallmark of the fact that we're kind of a supportive community and we're always, thinking of each other and drawing lines between all the different kinds of people. And I really love that about the work that we all do.
Yeah. And especially in kind of the crossover work of science and science communication and taking the sort of academic out of the ivory tower and into the real world where real people are utilizing this information. And of course, that's a big part of some of the work that you do. But before we dive into what you actually do, because I'm going to need a map to navigate it, let's start with a little bit of how you got to where you are today. So would you call yourself a biologist, a biophysicist? How would you kind of or a neuroscientist? How would you describe your sort of academic hat that you wear?
So my most complicated way of describing myself is a cellular and molecular neuroscientist.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what that means is when I was a kid, I loved science. I was super lucky to have great science teachers growing up in my public school, but I also had all these hobbies in music and theater. And so when I got to college and they forced me to choose a major, how dare they? I wanted to think of something that would tie together all the things that I know and love. And so I thought, well, how about the biology of how people and animals, think and create and move and, have emotions. That was very anthropomorphic. But and then I thought, well, okay, that's the nervous system. So I really wanted to understand the complexities of the nervous system. So that led me to become a neuroscientist.
Nice. And what did you study in an effort to get there? Because I know that there's so many different circuitous paths. There's so many different ways that we can technically kind of increase our education and ultimately do what we want to do.
Right. So I have an undergraduate degree in neurobiology and behavior, but my PhD is technically in biophysics, which means that I did a lot of work with cells and molecules and trying to understand how signals are relayed from one end of the cell to the other and between cells. And there are all sorts of really interesting molecules that are in the membranes of nerve cells that open and close under different conditions. They're called ion channels. And they actually change the polarity of the cell, whether they're more negative or positive. And that allows there to be communication from one end of the nerve cell to the other. And then little chemicals are released, and then little receptors on the neighboring cell recognize those chemicals. And so all of those ion channels and receptors have interesting structures. And so all of my work over the 17 years that I was actually in the laboratory was to understand how did the structure of a molecule actually encode how it functioned under different conditions. So I actually used to mutate the molecule and then see how its behavior changed. And that was the kind of work I did.
Interesting. And you kind of, like you mentioned, you had this long career in academia doing basically like wet work, as a bench scientist. And then it started to morph and develop more into overseeing, maybe more of an administrative, like overseeing research. Like, how did you make that transition?
So there were a couple of factors. One of them was that I'm definitely a people person. And I'm interested in how people work, and I'm also interested in how teams of people work. And that's always been true. And I'm also interested in people from different cultures. So, maybe that's just a personality trait. And I like the big picture. I like connecting and bridging between different things. So I had this very in-depth scientific training, but I wondered whether I could be even more useful if I was up a couple of levels at sort of that bridging level of how we do science. And I also was married to a scientist, and everyone's probably heard of the two body problem, where one person gets a job in one place and one person gets a job in the other, and then you have to make this big decision: where are we going to live? So my husband, actually, we were living in Los Angeles. We were both at Caltech at the time, but he got the job of his dreams in Houston at NASA. And I grilled him about whether it was really worth it uprooting the family. And he said, "Oh, please, oh, please." And I was like, "Okay." So it was nice in a way because it gave me an opportunity to pause and reflect, and because it kind of disrupted my research career. What can I do next? And where would I get the most satisfaction and be the most helpful? And there was an opportunity for me to also go work at NASA in the life sciences programs there. They needed people who could think about overall science strategies and collaborations between different kinds of people and partners. So one of the interesting things about space exploration is that it takes a lot of different kinds of people to solve the problems to allow us to have successful human exploration missions. And although this was the research program, it's an applied research program. So it has to enable the operations on missions. But that means that the medical doctors, the researchers, the engineers, the administrators all have to work together. And then they have to work with our commercial partners. They have to work with our international partners. So I found that I was good working on strategies that helped to focus everybody in on a common goal and work well together to move towards that common goal. But it allowed me to use my scientific training because I had to understand what the science was in order to understand how to bring everyone together in order to do good science.
And so does this work only involve crewed missions? Is it all about sending human beings into space, or is there a lot of kind of on Earth work as well that you are helping to manage?
Well, that's an excellent question. So, and to I think we're going to talk about some of the other work I do, but just right now, I am actually in I'm the associate chief scientist of the Human Research Program. So that's one of my current jobs,
Yeah,
and
one
that's
of, yeah.
right. That's my job at NASA right now, and we are responsible for basically figuring out how to protect the human on long duration exploration missions. You know, we're doing pretty well in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station. And we've been doing that for decades now. And we've done some very, very interesting research to try to understand how the factors of the space environment affect human beings. So that includes a different level of gravity, radiation is an issue, isolation and confinement is an issue, you know, how far away from home you are, and of course all the life support systems we need, you know, the air we breathe, the food we need to eat, the waste systems, you know, the suits we need in order to live and work outside of whatever spacecraft we're on. So all of those issues have the potential of creating a risk to human health and performance. And since we're an applied research program, that's what we have to be watching out for. We want these people to stay healthy, and that's even after they come back decades later. But we also need them to be able to perform what they need to do on the mission. Now, you hit a very good point. Do we do our most basic research all the way up in space? Well, no. Space flight's expensive and uber complicated to carry out. So anything we can do in laboratories or analog facilities on the Earth, that's what we'll do first. So we have all sorts of really interesting analogs for spaceflight that mimic some of those different hazards that I mentioned. So, for instance, we collaborate with a lot of our international partners on something called bed rest, which is where you actually lie in bed head down, and that causes the fluid in your body to shift. And that mimics the effect of being in reduced gravity, like when you're in orbit around the Earth on the International Space Station, because there's when you're in space, your fluid shifts headward and you unload all your muscles and bones. And then that has a cascade of different effects on different systems in your body, you know, your heart, your bones, your muscles, your brain, even your eyes. And so we want to understand the basis of those changes so that then we can protect the astronauts from any damage that will cause them a problem while in space or afterwards. So you hit the nail on the head. We'll study whatever we can on the ground first, even with things like short duration space flight missions. They're called parabolic flight, where you kind of go up in a big jet or a small jet relatively, and go up and you do an arc, which gives you a couple of seconds of weightlessness, which mimics having reduced gravity. And then you quickly do a couple of experiments and take some data. So, yeah, absolutely. We do what we can on Earth. We also try to learn whatever we can from other research that's happening that might be applicable to spaceflight. You know, anything that's happening in the medical world or other biological research. So we have to pay attention to all of that.
And of course, the work that you do, and specifically, I'm just looking here. You're working. Maybe you can explain, and maybe it's not even that interesting. But you're working for the Aerospace Corporation, which then works for the NASA or with the NASA Human Research Program, right?
That's right. I am. The Aerospace Corporation is a nonprofit, and we have lots of smart people there, and they are able to carry out lots of jobs at NASA. So I'm not technically a government employee, and I work at NASA to carry out my jobs, but through the Aerospace Corporation.
And so it's also a nonprofit. So basically you are, heavily involved with two nonprofits.
Yes. So it was really funny because I do have a security clearance. And when I filled out all the paperwork for that, I realized I have actually never worked for a for-profit because all the universities, all the university consortiums, the government, none of those places are for-profit. And I haven't done it yet, but I thought to myself, maybe I need to try that just so I can add it to my experience base. But I've got enough on my plate right now, so I haven't actually tried it out yet.
Yeah, because you basically have two full-time jobs.
I do. If you could see me, you would see the bags under my eyes, man. It is just, it's a lot, but it's really a really cool time to be doing both of the things that I'm doing, and I just can't say no. It's really a fascinating time to be working in space human research, because we're right at the cusp of a new era. There are so many different space agencies than there were even 20 years ago when I started working with NASA. And there are lots of new commercial companies, and they're taking up people who are, civilians. They're not NASA astronauts, and people are getting to experience space. And the cool thing from the research perspective, and I know we're going to talk about the other job in a minute, from the research perspective is these are people who don't necessarily all fit the NASA astronaut profile that we've had over the last 5 or 6 decades. And so it's an opportunity for NASA to work with these commercial companies and these other kinds of people flying in space to get a wider database on what does space do to the human body. And I know I've been focusing mostly on the human body, but remember, there's also the mind and behavior, which is a hugely important thing. I mean, imagine going to Mars in a small vehicle with 4 or 5 other people, and the trip's going to take 2 or 3 years, and there's not much to see out the window until you get pretty close to Mars. You're going to have to work really hard to make sure that team gets along and can do things well together, and that people don't get bored or annoyed. So there's fascinating research, and the neuroscientist in me thinks that's some of the most fun research is, how do you keep those individuals and those teams of people happy on those incredible journeys to other planets like Mars?
Yeah, and of course, as somebody who's also spent some time in the neurosciences and now in psychology, it seems so obvious that this is such an important kind of part of the equation. But historically, we thought about the quote right stuff, right? We thought about a very different kind of standard for who we would be sending off this planet. And now that we're talking about long, like very long distance space flight, and we're talking about all of the specific details that you actually just mentioned, the psychological profile may even be more important than some sort of kind of physical or physiologic profile.
And that's part of the evolution of what's happening with space exploration as we turn our eyes to, especially in low Earth orbit, it's going to be a much more commercial environment. There are companies planning to build new space stations that will orbit the Earth. And eventually, and by the end of this decade, the ISS will no longer be available and will be anybody who wants to be in low Earth orbit on a station is going to be going to a different kind of station. And we're planning to go back to the moon and put more footprints on the moon, including people of color and women. So that's pretty exciting. But a lot for the human research program, which is always looking towards the distant objective. Not always. We have to support the International Space Station work and the moon, but our goals are more than just thinking about the immediate time. We're thinking about 10 years from now or more. And so we're thinking about that first set of human beings that goes to Mars. And, it's pretty interesting stuff. And you said something about how we weren't really originally focusing that much on behavior. That's because if you think about it, when space flight started, first we had to make sure we could keep everybody alive.
Right. Yeah, just fundamental, just very basic stuff. Let's not let them die.
Right. So we consider that kind of like the first you survive, then you thrive. And now we're getting to revisit some of those thriving questions. And it's not like we've been ignoring them, but they're, as you said, they're becoming more and more important for these newer kinds of exploration missions.
Absolutely. And so the funny thing is that when we talk about these two hats that you wear, the two kind of jobs that you are at the helm of, there's a lot of crossover, but they're also in some ways very, very different. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about SciArt Exchange and maybe let us know about it in the context of how it relates to the other work that you do, but also like all of the great differences that you get to celebrate.
Sure. I think the best way to talk about how I ended up being the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called SciArt Exchange is to tell you a little bit about how it all happened. So that whole path actually grew out of my wonderful experiences initially working at NASA. So one of the things, I've probably because of my music and theater background, I am very interested in communicating. And I was learning, to my surprise, that I felt as though there was not, and so, we're going back like, I don't know, 12 years or so, that there were too many people who didn't really understand and appreciate what was happening in space exploration and development. I was shocked actually that people didn't know there was an International Space Station. And some of them were even in science museums at that moment, space science museums. And I was like, how is it that we're just not communicating about that, especially given that there's a lot of power in what's going on in space? And by power, what I mean is, in order to go further in space, all kinds of science and technology have to evolve. We have to improve our communication systems, our medical systems, our tools for doing research, our understanding of human behavior. So much has to evolve and our understanding of ethics, our political rules, our collaborations with other countries. It's a really interesting potential collaboration that the world can get behind as the human race to push further from Earth into the solar system and beyond. So wouldn't it be really important that as many people as possible kind of understand what's going on in space and all the different kinds of things? So I became very interested just in how we communicate about what's going on in space. So that was one thing. Then the other thing is as I told you, I was herding cats for these international research collaborations. And so I was constantly thinking, what makes an effective team of people trying to solve a problem? I think we've all been on those teams in school where like 2 of the 4 people didn't do anything, and yet y'all got the same grade. That's not an effective team. So so we can all personally relate to that. And what makes a good team? And then the third thing that I was really interested in is then the neuroscientist really kicks in again is how do we foster our own creative problem solving? How do we foster how do we be the best we can in thinking creatively? And how do we look for answers in the widest group possible to solve those problems? So those three things were percolating in my head. And then back in 2009, I was on this science planning committee for an international meeting that was here locally in Houston. And it was a tough time in space. There were a lot of changes going on, and people were sort of, wondering, what does the future hold? So the leader of the group said, well, let's call the theme of this conference the next golden age of human space exploration. And for some reason, that was my light bulb moment. So I thought to myself, well, if all we insiders are going to sit around and plot the next golden age, don't we need to bring the ideas from outside of our group into that conversation? And probably most importantly, shouldn't we involve the kids of today in that conversation? Because nothing moves fast in space development, not that fast. And so those kids are going to be the workforce. So we'll sit around and we'll plan it, but they're the ones who have to carry it out. So don't they need to have some role in that process? I thought to myself, how do I bring the thinking of kids about the future of space exploration into a conference of a bunch of adults already in the industry? And I said, we need a common language. And what's more is I think it should be international. So I said, okay, we're going to use art. And so we ended up, and since my hobbies are music and theater and I can't paint to save my life, it needs to be multimedia art, stuff that, I can really sink my teeth into. So there was no money for this conference because, this was a late idea, but they're like, okay, let's humor Jancy. So they said, okay, you can hold an online contest. And they're thinking, we're going to get a couple of stick figures, it'll be fine. Well, we got fabulous artwork, symphonies, and really well post-produced films and stories and beautiful works of visual art from all around the world. And I had also asked the team whether I could present this artwork at the opening ceremony during the conference, so I could foster a dialogue between the generations. And they're like, nah, we can't do that. Then when they saw the art, they're like, wow, Jancy, can you fold this into the opening ceremony? And so I did, with lots and lots of help, because remember, there wasn't a budget for this. So everybody pulled together, and that was the birth of the Humans in Space Art program. So it was happening while I was still a scientist at NASA, and it started with children. But then over the years, we used the same idea, an online contest and a tour of the artwork. So you influence the participants and get them to want to learn and think about what's going on in space, and then to go a couple steps in the future and talk about their vision for what the future holds. And then you use the best artwork in displays and live performances that you kick back out around the world, so that now that artwork starts a dialogue with all the listeners and the viewers. And so that started a thing. And we tested it. We had adults, we had children, we worked with professional artists, we worked with professional scientists, and it was doing well. And it was frankly too big for me to handle as a scientist, and it didn't really belong as a NASA program. So I spun it off as a nonprofit, and I took a couple years off from NASA to try to establish SciArt Exchange. And we did a couple of really fun things. We held a couple of really great contests with really big touring events. We got up to 12,000 participants and over 3 million in-person artwork views. And then the pandemic hit. Yeah, which has changed everyone's lives, and we're just sort of crawling out of it, and we haven't all recovered. And we still did some really really important work because we felt since we were used to working online, we knew we had some tools about how to communicate, and we created a pandemic project with no funding. We just pulled it together in 8 weeks. I mean, like we pulled it together in 2 weeks. and then and then and then it lasted for 8 weeks, and it's actually still open, which was called the Design Your Habitat campaign. And it was, while everybody was isolated and confined, we felt that there was so much we could learn from people in the space industry who work expecting that the natural conditions of space are to be isolated and confined. So, what do we know from space exploration about how to survive and thrive in an environment like that? And so, we encouraged people to create artwork that was basically designing either their earthly or their space habitat. And we had video podcasts with people, astronauts, space architects. We even had some fashion designers, doing some really interesting work with putting some biological feedback materials in their fashions, and even a chef who uses a multisensory approach to make food palatable and interesting and different. And so that was cool. But the pandemic kept going on and on and on. So I went back to NASA thinking, well, SciArt Exchange was awesome, but I'm not quite sure it's sustainable. And then we got an unexpected $1 million grant
Oh,
last
wow.
August.
Okay. So in 2021?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
And it was from the Club for the Future, and they are supported by Blue Origin, and they selected 19 nonprofits that they wanted to support who worked in the sector of STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, and space. And there were just a couple of us who also worked in what we call STEAM, which is when you add the arts to STEM. And so now we're in a flurry of figuring out how to have even greater impact, because now we have what we needed so that we could bring in more talented people and do a better job understanding how do we reach out to the world and get them interested in what's happening in space, invite them to have a role, and then sort of like the next level up, train them so that, they're really good science communicators, creative thinkers, and team players. And then eventually be able to create a forum to bring them together to solve the grand challenges that we're going to be facing ahead in space and beyond. So that's where SciArt Exchange is. And it really did grow out of my NASA work. And I also think my experience in thinking about creative problem solving, teamwork, and science communication probably makes me better at NASA as well.
That's great. And so tell me about individuals, people listening to the show right now who are like, this sounds interesting. How do I get involved in this?
Well, we always have activities going on. So one way is to, get on our mailing list. We do actually have something opening in a week, which is a little bit a field of what we've done normally. It's not human space exploration, it's Earth observations, and how taking pictures of the Earth really helps us support local communities in solving some of their grand challenges, like dwindling fish supplies and air pollution and smoke from fire and stuff like that. And it's a comic strip contest. So it's kind of a fun thing that we're launching. We're also all over social media, and we also just love to hear from people who want to participate either in our activities, or they can be judges for our contests, or just support us in, with resources or volunteering. And we do also try, especially through our social media, to show people examples of the power of what happens when you bring the arts. And, remember that includes music, film, literature, and visual art together with space science and technology, and the amazing creative problem solving that happens when you work at that integrated line.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of following on along on social media, looking at the website where you have a lot of the different contests and events listed, individuals can participate if they want to participate, or just learn from and observe and appreciate the participation of all of the talented multimedia artists that are out there.
Absolutely. And keep engaged, because as I mentioned, we are poised to really hit a growth phase. And so we are going to be experimenting with new kinds of activities, new ways to help us all become better problem solvers and better teammates. And communication is at the basis of all of that, as you know very well as well. And so we can all learn from each other and from the experiences of others and from just doing things. I frequently give a lecture on just a very simplified view of what creativity is. And I don't know if you can pop into your head what a Venn diagram looks like, but it's always a bunch of circles, and then there's a piece in the middle where they all overlap. So if you think that creativity is where the overlap is, the three circles that contribute to that are having a broad and deep knowledge base. So don't just study one thing, but go out there and experience the world and follow your passions and learn different things. For me, it was music and theater. And who would have ever thought that that would actually later make me a different kind of scientist? And so, a broad experience and knowledge base. And the other is to work really hard to try to recognize in yourself when you're not thinking openly. That's really tough, because we get in habits and we use the same mental approach to solve a problem. And if you pause and you say, am I doing the same thing over and over again? And that's helpful. And then the third thing is motivation. So you've got to be passionate about something in order to be creative, because being creative is hard. It's hard work. So if you're not motivated, it's not going to happen. But, to give people the tools to be able to do all of that, and the excitement, and understand why some of these creative challenges are important to solve. Why is space interesting? It's not just what is interesting, but why. Why is it important? I think that's pretty fun and pretty cool.
You mentioned sort of how SciArt Exchange developed. And, if I were to ask you why art, you sort of told the story of your personal journey and how this angle sort of came to be. But I'm wondering, now that you've been doing this for a while and you can kind of sit and reflect on all of the things that you've learned so far in your work at SciArt, and I asked you that same question again, why art? I'm wondering how you might approach that question. Why art? Why does this matter, especially when it comes to space, especially when it comes to science, when it comes to society?
So I think that one of the most important elements for educating, doing hard things, and it's going to sound a little bit redundant, but I'll try to say it in a different way, is I have to know, why do I care? It's the so what. And that's actually an extremely important aspect of science communication, as you know, too. And if you can't let your audience or the person, your teammate, or your mom and dad, or whomever you're trying to talk to, understand the so what of something, it's very hard for them to really believe, well, not so much believe, but just to get excited about something. So, a lot of people try to move SciArt Exchange into kind of like the traditional education realm. And at best, I think of us as informal educators. Our job is to engage and inspire so that somebody cares about space and science and technology. And then there's all this brilliant curriculum out there that once you care, you can go out and you can learn a whole bunch of things. But a lot of times that spark, that inspiration is missing. Well, what's super good at inspiration and telling the so what story? It's the arts, which again, it's not just visual art. It's includes performing arts, and everybody responds to something different. I'm a music person. You can completely change my mood depending on what music I'm listening to. For other people, it's to read something. Though the arts are an incredible way to send that message of why should I care?
And really they are so instrumental throughout the lifespan as well. So I'm curious, I think a lot of what we've been speaking about right now are sort of things that would interest us and things that would excite us. But I'm wondering about the little ones, if there's a way for them to be involved or if their participation is highlighted within SciArt Exchange.
So we do have a tendency when we're starting our own youth art competitions, we tend to target 10 to 18 for youth, but that's just so that our messaging can assume a certain level of reading capabilities and a certain level of sophistication of the artwork. Because remember, we're not just a contest, we're also a tour. And so the artwork has to be sophisticated enough so that when someone else sees it, they're like, wow, I'm inspired. So that's not to say that there aren't some amazing artists out there who are 6 years old. There are. And we never kick someone out of a contest if they're younger than the age group. But that's generally what we target as 10 to 18. However, we work with other organizations who focus on children who go down to age 4. And I remember, and that's a really interesting creative age group, of course. And I have had some challenging moments presenting to, elementary schoolers and middle schoolers. And I even tried to explain artificial gravity to a group of preschoolers once. That pretty much exhausted me, but it was fun and interesting. And one should one should never underestimate the creativity and the intellect of a child. We just do that as adults. No, just like I said, when we talked about how the Humans in Space Art program came to be, nobody expected the artwork to be as good as it was. But we gave those children around the world as broad an opportunity as possible to relay their visions of the future. And partially because we didn't narrow them into a box, they just shocked everybody. So, so there are opportunities there. We just don't. We as the nonprofit don't target that group specifically, not yet. But as I said, we're going to be doing all kinds of interesting experiments over the next couple of years to really try to have greater impact. And we will be doing a lot more than just contests and artwork tours.
So tell me, Jancy, as somebody with such a diverse kind of background and also somebody who's looking forward in such a diverse way, whether it be through your understanding of these neural mechanisms of behavior, whether it be the work that you've done in understanding human subjects or human participants in space, or through all of the incredible work you've done with SciArt Exchange. I'm curious how you would approach the closing questions that I ask all of my guests that come on the show. And they're sort of big picture questions, and they're all about looking to the future. So are you ready to tackle them?
I don't know. What are the questions?
Here we go. All right. When you think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you right now. So, again, your work brings you multiple perspectives, but you also have a personal life. You also have a place within your community, within society, within the globe, and within the cosmos. So, whatever context feels relevant as you sit with me right now, I want to know first, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned about? Where are you finding worry, maybe pessimism, maybe even cynicism? But then on the flip side of that, so that we end on a more kind of hopeful note, where are you finding that optimism and that hope? What are you truly looking forward to?
So I am a very realistic idealist. So that's what I am. So you're going to allow me to flip on both sides of my personality. So the idealist in me is very sad that we are not doing a better job working together. It's been a hard couple of years, and instead of bringing many of us together, it seems to be polarizing us. And I am concerned about what seems to me to be kind of the undoing of some things that I think are really important to making a safe global community and having us feel that we can work together to do what the human race needs to do going forward. And so that has me very, very concerned. And I'm also very worried, and this is going to not be terribly original, but I am extremely worried on the impact that the pandemic has had on multiple age groups. So I do have children, and the impact seems to be different for different age groups. But young adults seem to be going through a very difficult time. And, that's going to be very egocentric because I have young adults. But, seeing a lot of really bad things happen over the last couple of years, many of them are angry and many of them are sad, and they're losing hope that we're going to come out of this mess. And, pretty much the only advantage of becoming an old person is that you've been through a lot of ups and downs, and you sort of have this idea that you're probably going to come out the other end. Well, young adults are really starting to feel responsible for the world, but they haven't lived through quite so many ups and downs. So I've had over 30, 35 interns, and I always try to reach them as people and try to help them to maintain hope and think about how they can get through difficult periods like this. And that brings me to your other question, which is what's your optimism and your hope? I think it's really interesting that young adults are very interested in doing good in the world. They are my generation was taught to put a roof over their head and make sure there was food on the table. And I think that's still very, very important. But I am a lucky person of my generation to have also been able to find and follow my passions. I think that many of the, 20 somethings that I work with think that it's important to have meaning in their lives. And I'm hoping that that pursuit of meaning is going to help lift their spirits post pandemic and also help them to find work that they can get passionate about. Because if you care, you can do a really good job.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And is that really where you're finding that hope is kind of in that generation?
It's my concern and my hope. It pains me to see that, but it can be very inspiring as well. Like everything, you have to find your balancing act, right? You can't be all about your passions. You also have to be practical. But I think that if enough people care about what's going on in the world and pursue ways to improve it, and, hopefully, up their own individual and team skills and creative problem solving and all of that, that we'll actually be able to solve these challenges and we will move forward and hopefully together, you know, I'm I'd really like to see us work as the human race to solve these problems.
Agree wholeheartedly. Well, gosh, Jancy, is there anything that, as we're kind of looking back on this hour that we've spent together, with regards to the places where you've been putting your efforts, or just with regards to your interest areas, that you feel like we didn't touch on, that you'd be remiss if we bid our adieus prior to discussing?
So I just wanted to tell one other little story.
Sure.
And you can include it or not. So I frequently get asked to help at STEM events for children. And they'll invite me because they want me to steam the event. They want me to figure out how to put kind of an art angle in it so they can entice a broader sector of children. And when I'm at these events, the parents will come up, and they'll recognize that I'm Dr. McPhee, and they want to know, so little Johnny or little Jane is really, really interested in space and science and all of that. How do I help nurture their interest? And if they go to some of the other people at this event, they're going to be told to do robotics and go to programming summer camp and all of those things. And all those things are genuinely awesome. But when they come to me, I tell them to if they want to take a dance class, have them do that. If they want to do musical theater during the summer, have them do that. And they look at me curiously, like, why did she not tell them to go to engineering camp? And it's because of that desire of exposing people to as many things and experiences and as broadly as they can be, because you can't predict now how that's going to influence a person decades later. And so I'm a big advocate to, encourage people to don't shut your doors and follow your passions.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. And I think those listening, whether it be for themselves, for their children, or for the individuals in their lives, there's something to be taken from that. Well, Dr. Jancy McPhee, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time with us today, for sharing your passions, and for educating us about the really cool work that you're doing.
Well, thank you for including me in your podcast. It was fun.
Absolutely, it was. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.